Ever since I could comprehend anything, I had an obsession, an addiction with stories. Even before I could read, I was listening to books on tape, listening to tales that my parents told me, listening to songs that shared stories within its lyrics. And then, once I was able to read on my own, that turned into just wasting all my money at Borders and then Barnes& Noble, and the independent bookshops that began popping up around where I lived. Now, something happened around my college years, because pre that, I always had a book in hand. I spent almost all my free time at the bookstore reading books there because I couldn't afford all the books I wanted to read. I remember I used to put my baby sister in her stroller and I'd walk, I think it's a mile, I recently looked it up, to sit at the bookstore while she was napping to just read everything I could lay my hands on. And in fact, I was even known as the bookworm, the reader, and it was a title I wore with such pride. But when college rolled around, my love for reading, I don't want to say it diminished because I still loved reading, but there were no books that I loved. I'd reached a point where the type of books I loved to read were starting to get repetitive. I had a deep love for fantasy and paranormal, and the books I was reading had the same tropes. I was in high school during the time of love triangles and Mary Sue's, and to be fair, those things still do exist, but there was like this huge resurgence of them within the paranormal world. And the truth was, I didn't even really care for romance. I just really loved reading about an ordinary person diving into a world that was new to them and then going through all the awful things that came out of it. Every book was predictable. Every book just angered me because I was like, I'm so tired of reading this golden girl trope where just an ordinary person would change a monster. Basically Beauty and the Beast, the Disney version. And I love Beauty and the Beast, but I have seen that film a lot and I have read many, many different adaptations of it, or I guess I should say, really, it's the Persephone and Hades story, just retold and retold and retold. So I kept calling myself the bookworm, the reader, and yet I couldn't think of a single new book I picked up from the bookstore and read. I can name a few off the top of my head, but there were such long lulls in between, and soon I started feeling a little bit of a fraud. How could I say I was a big reader if I wasn't going to the bookstore daily to buy new books? How could I say I was a huge reader when I didn't actually know what was next month's releases? And I began to feel very upset with myself, and I remember just slowly stepping away from BookTube and Bookstagram because I was like, I don't feel connected to this anymore. And I hate that about myself. And that was a hard thing to wrap my head around. Then around the time when I started to get back into reading and I was finally finding my feet again, I became chronically ill. And suddenly my reading speed, my comprehension weakened. My reading speed lessened, and I didn't know what to do with that because before I would read a book in a day, and now it was taking me months to finish something of the same length and reading level. So I was in this weird place. Who was I? What am I? Am I a reader? And through these past few years, I've come to a really healthy mental spot with it, where I've basically learned two things. One, as you get older, life becomes a bit more much. It becomes a bit much. And you have so much more responsibilities that take your brain away from what you're currently doing. Also, just because my brain can't comprehend how it once did, it doesn't mean that my reading speed dictates whether or not I'm a reader. I do think this whole idea of, oh, I've read this many books in a month, that means I'm a real reader, is very capitalistic and competitive. And to me, once you put a competition into something, it's kind of soiled, it's tainted, and things like art should never be a competition. This isn't a sport, you know? Reading, writing, painting, singing, it should be about the art and the intention and the escapism that it gives you. So, wrapping my brain around that, I then had to ask myself, why am I not drawn to books? Like, we figured out the whole health side of it, the whole just kind of calming me down, but like, why? Why can't I get into books? So then what I did was I went through the past 3 years of books that I could not put down. And this was pretty hard because I think I've only read around like maybe 20, 25 books in the past 3 years, which sounds actually like a lot. But some of them I didn't finish, some of them I didn't enjoy, and I don't like counting books I never enjoyed. So I went through that list in my mind and I tried to think, okay, what are the books that I loved and I couldn't stop talking about and were good? Because I think it's very easy and entertaining to read a bad book. You know that there's like an adrenaline high from it. But it is hard to read a good book you have no interest in. So we're keeping this to good books that I believe are well-written good books. There's no like jury out on it. It's just my personal opinion. And I came up with these three, which were kind of shocking. The first book that I read out of these three was, I think, 3 years ago, and it was Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire. I had to double check because everyone says Interview with the Vampire, but it's The Vampire. I got this book as a hand-me-down from a friend when I was in middle school. The thing was that I had literally no interest in it reading the back, and then in high school I saw the film and I thought, oh, this doesn't sound like my cup of tea. And then I read it 3 years ago and it became one of my favorite books. I didn't continue the series because I don't want to invest in the books and support the author, but since I already owned it, I didn't see the problem in reading it. But this book was beautiful, and I remember reading it and turning to Henry going, I shouldn't love this book. There's nothing about this book that should be calling to me. I am not a fan of first person. I'm not a fan of someone telling their life story, but I love this book. And I think this may be the best vampire book I have personally ever read. I have read Dracula. I'm not a fan of Dracula. I have read a lot of paranormal romance. Not going to get into that. But I would say this book and Carmilla are the two best vampire stories I've ever read. The other two books, the next one is The Girl on the Train. This book was a bit weird that I even read it. Basically, I had a friend who I had voiced to that I was having a really hard time getting back into reading, and he said that he had this book and he wanted to read it and we should book club it together. And I did that, and surprisingly, once again, it's first person. It's like a weird, well, it's a whodunit. We'll just leave it at that. I shouldn't have liked this book, and I couldn't put it down. I literally hated every character. I saw the film after I read the book, and it was quite awful. I don't know how they messed up this adaptation. Like, they had all British actors, and yet they moved it to New York for some reason. Weird. The last book of books that I could not put down and I couldn't stop thinking about when I wasn't reading them would be Donna Tartt's The Secret History. This book I have already talked about recently. I recently finished it, and I will say this is definitely going to be on the list of books I will love probably forever. And once again, why do I like this? Now, taking these 3 books, I should also mention there are a couple other newer books that I did really like. I mean, I loved reading them, but they didn't haunt me. They didn't, like, when I put the book down, I wasn't thinking about them. So that's kind of what we're going off of here. So I took these 3 books, which are technically within different genres, and I thought, what are the similarities? Because maybe, just maybe, my tastes have changed. Just like I grow and mature and evolve, so should my reading taste. After a lot of thinking, I've realized they're all first person, which is crazy to me because I have always stood by the fact that I hate first person. It's other than this book, I did not like the tense of this book. I think it was present tense, and I'm really not a fan of present tense. But we're all telling stories through personal narratives, which very weird because I'm a very plot-driven person than a character-driven person. Also, these 2 are stories told from far, far into the future. And these are about something that happened to them years prior, or the story of their life, a retelling of them. They're documenting their journey for you. So obviously it's an untrustworthy narrative. It's very romanticized. Things are exaggerated, and I really loved it. But also, the big theme here is murder, actually. Some in a mythical sense, and some in a people need to go to jail sense. And that wasn't too much of a surprise. I am someone who really, really loves murder mysteries, and I grew up loving murder mysteries. But this experiment has definitely made me think, okay, maybe I'm into dark literature, dark personal narrative literature with an untrustworthy narrative, which also kind of makes sense with the classics that I have been more called to over the past 5 years. This has just been something that's been weighing on my mind, which is what makes a reader, and allowing yourself to change genres that you say that you love. Now, if you're anything like me, then you're probably a creature of habit, and to change a direction, to change something that you have labeled yourself as, even though I really do hate labels, it's scary. You know, I've defined myself for so long as this bookworm, as this fantasy lover, and throughout these past few months, I've had to take a really good hard look at myself and realize, okay, I'm not a fantasy lover how I used to be. Like, my favorite fantasy books were by Gail Carson Levine when I was a kid, and then that transitioned into boarding school fantasies in high school and small town paranormal romances, and now it's like, okay, no, I actually need some murder here. I need the mythical creatures to be scary, not hot. I need to see people suffer, which that sounds awful. Like, I don't want that in my real life. But when I read a book, I don't know. Like, I'm guessing that's the theme. If you've read these 3 books, please leave down in the comments below what you think the overlapping theme is. And also, I'm wondering if you're kind of in the same boat. Look at the stage of life you are at now and then compare it to the one before. How's your reading taste changed, and has your speed changed? I should mention, I think you can read quickly, obviously, even if you have a lot going on, but I think it's harder to comprehend the text. So for me, I'd much rather read slower to fully find all the layers and just let it envelop me. Obviously, I do have that reading challenge that I mentioned at the beginning of the year, where I'm not allowed to buy any new books until I finish all the books I own, or try to read all the books I own. If I don't like it, I'm getting rid of it so I can make room for new books. But now that I have this in mind, I kind of know how to approach that by having murder mysteries, suspense thrillers, gothic books be every other. So that way I keep with this reading momentum and really enjoying my reading renaissance, if you will. All right, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.